The Afghanistan papers show that there was a lot of happy talk going on for 20 years. Because year after year after year, even though they were telling the public about great progress being made with the Afghan military and police forces, well, behind the scenes, they all knew damn well that the Afghanistan military and police forces were a mess and not nearly as competent as the Taliban has proven itself to be. They were so frank about their assessments behind closed doors that it makes their lies in public so obvious and so egregious. They knew that the Afghan military was made up of a lot of people that were just there for the paycheck. They knew that a lot of the members of the military and police force were hooked on drugs. Drugs being heroin, sleepy drugs, not the kind that make you all amped up and motivated. They also knew from interviewing the members of the Afghanistan military and police forces that if the Americans left, they intended to stop fighting too. They knew that members of the Taliban itself were infiltrating the military and police forces. And they knew this stuff for years, and it never got better. And in the last few years, the Taliban has been getting stronger and stronger. And again, this information became public in 2019. And so President Biden certainly had it available to him.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 238th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, this is a podcast that I started about 9 years ago. Actually, almost exactly 9 years ago now that I think about it, because it was September of 2012. Yeah, it's been 9 years. Look at that. Well, this is a podcast that I started because I wanted to know what Congress was doing with my money and in my name. And I didn't feel like the corporate media was telling me everything, because once I started reading bills and laws on my own and watching lots of congressional hearings, I was learning a lot about our role in the world and where our money was going that just wasn't showing up on the news. And it was making me insane. And so I started this podcast. And the entire time that I've been doing this podcast, we have been at war in Afghanistan, where Congress was spending my money and was fighting in my name. And that war has finally come to an end. Now, I truly believe, I have absolutely no proof to back this up, but I do truly believe that a major catalyst for the actual end of the Afghanistan war was the publication of the Afghanistan papers in late 2019, which was a stunning work of journalistic brilliance that got kind of buried in the news cycle because it was released during the first Trump impeachment. But there is a book that has been created using the Afghanistan papers that I downloaded on Audible and listened to over the last few weeks. And if you really want to know what happened in Afghanistan these last 20 years, I recommend you do the same. Because what's really stunning about it is that from the very beginning, what is crystal clear is that we were lied to constantly by the leaders of our military and State Department. Because here's why we were told that our military was being sent to Afghanistan in the first place. This is then President and Commander-in-Chief George W. Bush on October 7th, 2001, less than 1 month after 9/11.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. More than 2 weeks ago, I gave Taliban leaders a series of clear and specific demands: close terrorist training camps, hand over leaders of the al-Qaeda network, and return all foreign nationals, including American citizens, unjustly detained in your country. None of these demands were met, and now the Taliban will pay a price. By destroying camps and disrupting communications, we will make it more difficult for the terror network to train new recruits and coordinate their evil plans.
Al-Qaeda. We wanted Al-Qaeda and their leaders, including their number one leader, Osama bin Laden. Because that's who knocked down those towers on September 11th, 2001. That's who crashed the plane into the Pentagon. That's who caused a group of innocent American travelers to end up in a ditch in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The Taliban didn't do that. The Taliban was the group, the Afghan version of a political party that was in control of the government of Afghanistan. And somewhere in their territory, our actual enemies, Al-Qaeda, trained for 9/11. But the Taliban didn't fund them, arm them, or send any humans to help them with their cause. The Taliban failed to stop them, but the Taliban did not do 9/11. And yet, from the beginning, the Taliban were treated like they did. The Taliban were treated like they were the same as Al-Qaeda. And because of that, the goal shifted very, very quickly from hunting down actual Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden to regime change in Afghanistan, changing the government in Afghanistan from one that was ruled by the Taliban to one that would be ruled by someone more friendly to us. And now here we are 20 years later, almost exactly, and the Taliban is back in control of Afghanistan. We failed. We lost the war. As I listened to the Afghanistan papers, I was struck by the tragedy in knowing that in the end, the war concluded with negotiations with the Taliban. But what war doesn't end with negotiations? Isn't that how they always end? You know, in war, regular peasants are sent to die, but the ending is always determined by elites who are sitting around a conference table. And this war was no different. And this one didn't have to take 20 years. Because negotiations with the Taliban were possible exactly 1 week after the start of the war. But the George W. Bush administration wanted a regime change. And so even though the Taliban had no direct role in that September event that we'll never forget, they were branded as our enemy, and the George W. Bush administration rejected an offer from the Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden to a neutral third country on October 14th, 2001. From that moment forward, the George W. Bush administration set out to create a new government in Afghanistan, modeled after the United States. Here's then Secretary of State Colin Powell testifying to Congress on October 25th, 2001, less than 3 weeks into the war.
Our work in Afghanistan, though, is not just of a military nature. We recognize that when the Al-Qaeda organization has been destroyed in Afghanistan, and as we continue to try to destroy it in all the nations in which it exists around the world, and when the Taliban regime has gone to its final reward, we need to put in place a new government in Afghanistan, one that represents all the people of Afghanistan, and one that is not dominated by any single powerful neighbor, but instead is dominated by the will of the people of Afghanistan.
And so for the last 20 years, our money, our neighbors, our friends, our family were sent to Afghanistan to try to build them a new government. For the last 20 years, we earned money to pay for and sent our people to die to enact a government jobs program in Afghanistan. A jobs program using our tax money to pay the military and police forces of the new Afghanistan government. But from the beginning, there was no big picture strategy for how to accomplish this. This war was privatized. So many aspects of it were done for profit. And it was privatized on a scale never seen before in American history. Our neighbors, our friends, our family members who were sent to Afghanistan to train their police and military forces were never taught the local language. The decision makers in the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations never placed any importance on learning and teaching what the Afghan lifestyle was. They didn't tailor the new government to the people of Afghanistan. Their plan was to copy and paste our government and enforce it with guns and bombs. Over the course of 20 years, the people of Afghanistan have been subjected to horrific violence, and they paid the highest costs. Whole communities were shattered over and over again for 20 years. For 20 years, they've had robots flying over their homes, robots with bombs in them. For 20 years, they went to bed at night knowing that some stranger with a remote control might drop one of those bombs in their neighborhoods. You know, maybe the teenage boy next door held a gun in public lately and has been branded as an enemy combatant. Because that was enough justification, legally and in reality, for the United States to blow up an entire neighborhood. Talk about terror. How anyone in Afghanistan has slept at all in the last 20 years, I hope I never have the misfortune to understand. Instead of learning about the Afghans and designing a system that would fit with their culture, the same arrogant group of elites who have reshaped our government to their benefit over the last 20 years attempted to shape an Afghan government to match it. Instead of aiming for a system based on fairness and justice, the elites chose to bomb those with doubts into submission. So much for death without trial. Basically, members of our military were set up to fail by those at the top, by those who made the decisions about how to conduct the war and to create the new government. This is a failure of those at the top. Specifically, I blame President George W. Bush for starting it, and Presidents Barack Obama and President Donald Trump for continuing it and never changing the strategy. I also blame their enablers in the last 10 Congresses, which, yes, does include longtime Senator Joe Biden, who spent more and more of our tax money even though they knew how much of it was being wasted, and who have still never used their power to rein in the executive branch that has been horrifically violent nonstop since 9/11. But now the Afghanistan war is over. And for that, I will be grateful to President Joe Biden, no matter what comes next, because I didn't expect this from him. He voted for this war, after all, and the regime change that came after it in Iraq. And he was the main Ukraine government flipper. You know, Joe Biden has never been known as anti-war. But he just ended one of our wars. This is from April 14th.
I'm speaking to you today from the Roosevelt, the Treaty Room in the White House, the same spot where on October of 2001, President George W. Bush informed our nation that the United States military had begun strikes on terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. It was just weeks after the terrorist attack on our nation that killed 2,977 innocent souls, that turned Lower Manhattan into a disaster area, destroyed parts of the Pentagon, and made hallowed ground of a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and sparked an American promise that we would never forget. We went to Afghanistan in 2001 to root out al-Qaeda, to prevent future terrorist attacks against the United States planned from Afghanistan. Our objective was clear. The cause was just. Our NATO allies and partners rallied beside us. And I supported that military action along with overwhelming majority of the members of Congress. More than 7 years later, in 2008, weeks before we swore the oath of office, President Obama and I were about to swear, President Obama asked me to travel to Afghanistan and report back on the state of the war in Afghanistan. I flew to Afghanistan, to the Kunar Valley, a rugged mountainous region on the border with Pakistan. What I saw in that trip reinforced my conviction that only the Afghans have the right and responsibility to lead their country, and that more and endless American military force could not create or sustain a durable Afghan government. I believed that our presence in Afghanistan should be focused on the reason we went in the first place, to ensure Afghanistan would not be used as a base from which to attack our homeland again. We did that. We accomplished that objective. I said, among with others, we'd follow Osama bin Laden to the gates of hell if need be. That's exactly what we did, and we got him. It took us close to 10 years to put President Obama's commitment into form, and that's exactly what happened. Osama bin Laden was gone. That was 10 years ago. Think about that. We delivered justice to bin Laden a decade ago, and we've stayed in Afghanistan for a decade since. Since then, our reasons for remaining in Afghanistan have become increasingly unclear, even as the terrorist threat that we went to fight evolved. Over the past 20 years, the threat has become more dispersed, metastasizing around the globe. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq and establishing affiliates in multiple countries in Africa and Asia. With the terror threat now in many places, keeping thousands of troops grounded and concentrated in just one country at a cost of billions each year makes little sense to me and to our leaders. We cannot continue the cycle of extending or expanding our military presence in Afghanistan, hoping to create ideal conditions for the withdrawal and expecting a different result. I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility onto a 5th. After consulting closely with our allies and partners, with our military leaders and intelligence personnel, with our diplomats and our development experts, with the Congress and the Vice President, as well as with Mr. Ghani and many others around the world, I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
And they did. Which, bias alert, I consider a good thing. It's something I've wanted for a long time. And I do have to give credit where it's earned. There were 2 commanders-in-chief who played a role in the end of the Afghanistan war.
When I came to office, I inherited a diplomatic agreement duly negotiated between the government of the United States and the Taliban that all U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just 3 months after my inauguration. That's what we inherited, that commitment. It's perhaps not what I would have negotiated myself, but it was an agreement made by the United States government, and that means something. So in keeping with that agreement and with our national interest, the United States will begin our final withdrawal, begin it on May 1 of this year.
President Trump did that negotiation. He conducted the negotiations with the Taliban that launched the beginning of the end. Now, he didn't invite President Ashraf Ghani, the president of the government we created, to those meetings, which couldn't have helped that government with its legitimacy issues, but the end was always going to happen around a conference table. And Trump found that conference table, and so let's give him credit where it's due. But let's also acknowledge what a lying, sniveling weasel Donald Trump is, because as he almost always does, he showed up to that conference table in bad faith, because he never intended to end the war. A few episodes ago, during the episode about the January 6th riot at the Capitol, I introduced you to Donald Trump's last Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller. Well, Chris Miller gave an interview to Defense One, which, as far as I know, seems to be a respected military-focused journalistic outlet. And in that interview with Defense One, Defense Secretary Miller confirmed that President Trump never intended to leave Afghanistan, and this is a guy who would know. Quoting from the article, quote, Miller said he understood Trump's May 1 withdrawal deal to be a negotiating tactic. The whole policy strategy going forward was Ghani was to have a deal with the Taliban, and it wasn't going to be a 50-50 split between the Afghan government and the Taliban. We knew that. It was going to be 75-25 majority Taliban. And then you flip this thing into an interim government, he said. The hope was that the process would have allowed the United States, either through Ghani or his replacement, to negotiate a new status of forces agreement to extend the U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan under the guise of continued counterterrorism training, unquote. President Trump and the military-industrial complex didn't want troops to leave Afghanistan, because let's not forget about the treasure that is still waiting to be found in that country. In the episode of mine titled Minerals Are the New Oil, we eavesdropped on discussions in Congress about the fact that China controls a stunningly large percentage of the rare earth minerals that are needed to operate much of the technology of the internet age. Afghanistan holds at least 1 trillion worth of those minerals, which were first discovered by the Soviets, who tried to control Afghanistan in the 1970s. In 2006, the George W. Bush administration also mapped the known mineral resources in Afghanistan. Then President Barack Obama set up a task force to try to build a mining industry in Afghanistan. And then President Trump was persuaded to keep troops in the country by our puppet Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, by dangling the prospect of gold, lithium, uranium, and other mineral mining contracts for American companies, to companies that funnel wealth without work to the shareholder class. The decision by President Biden to end the Afghanistan war was a politically brave one, because the elites of the military-industrial complex, the ones that FDR warned us about, they wanted our troops to stay. General Frank McKenzie, who's right now the commander of U.S. forces in the Middle East, General Austin Scott Miller, who leads NATO forces in Afghanistan, and General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all recommended retaining the current force of 2,500 troops. His decision also went against the recommendations of the Afghan Study Group. Now, here's what that is. This is Representative Stephen Lynch of Massachusetts in a House Committee on Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on National Security hearing that he was chairing on February 19th.
In the fiscal year 2020 omnibus bill, Congress, led by Senator Graham, Senator Patrick Leahy, and the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee of State, Foreign Ops, and related programs, they tasked the independent and bipartisan Afghanistan study group to, quote, consider the implications of a peace settlement or the failure to reach a settlement on U.S. policy, resources, and commitments in Afghanistan. After nearly 9 months of review and consultation with current and former U.S. and Afghan government officials, allies and partners, and other key stakeholders, the Afghanistan Study Group issued its final report earlier this month.
The Afghan study group that created that report had 3 co-chairs, just to show you who our current Congress looks to for advice on matters of war. One of the co-chairs was Nancy Lindborg, a Council on Foreign Relations member who, as president and CEO of the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, gets to pass out $300 million in grants around the world every year. Before getting that cushy gig, she was the president and CEO of the U.S. Institute for Peace, which was involved in the study group to the point of being thanked by the chairman, which is why I'm guessing that she was a co-chair. The second co-chair was General Joseph Dunford, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's highest-ranking military officer, and the top military advisor to both President Obama and President Trump. In other words, Joseph Dunford was one of the strategists who fucked up Afghanistan during the Obama and Trump administrations, as he was a top strategist from fall 2015 through fall 2019. Since leaving our government, he has been on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin, one of the largest defense contractors in existence, and he holds at least $290,000 worth of Lockheed Martin stock that we know of. And then there was the third co-chair, and the person who seemed to be the unofficial head of the study group, ex-Senator Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire, who you might remember as one of the triad of warmongers in the Senate Armed Services Committee made up of Chairman John McCain, Senator Lindsey Graham, and Senator Kelly Ayotte. Those 3 were a thing. Well, after getting booted out on her warmongering ass by the voters of New Hampshire in 2016, she's been making bank in the private sector. She sits on the board of 5 large multinational companies, including Boston Properties, which is a real estate development company, Blackstone, one of the world's largest, most influential investment firms, funneling wealth to those at the top of the shareholder class. She's on the board of directors at News Corp, the company that has inflicted Fox News upon the world. She's on the board at Caterpillar, which is a company that manufactures heavy equipment for construction, digging, and energy development. And perhaps most importantly here, she is on the board of directors of the defense contractor BAE Systems, which provided war products and maintenance in Afghanistan. But none of that, of course, was mentioned in the hearing. And here's the advice that the study group gave to Congress.
We recommend that U.S. troops remain beyond May 1st. We believe a precipitous withdrawal of U.S. and international troops in May would be catastrophic for Afghanistan, leading to civil war and allow the reconstitution of terror groups which threaten the United States within an 18 to 36-month period.
And here's how they suggested that extension of the war be marketed to the American people.
Let me be clear, although we recommend that our troops remain beyond May 1st, we propose a new approach toward Afghanistan, which aligns our policies, practices, and messaging across the United States government to support the Afghan peace process rather than prosecute a war. Our troops would remain not to fight a forever war, but to guarantee the conditions for a successful peace process and to protect our national security interests to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a haven again for terrorists who threaten the United States of America.
It's not a war, it's a peace process. But President Biden didn't play along.
But for those who have argued that we should stay just 6 more months or just 1 more year, I ask them to consider the lessons of recent history. In 2011, the NATO allies and partners agreed that we would end our combat mission in 2014. In 2014, some argued 1 more year. So we kept fighting. We kept taking casualties. In 2015, the same, and on and on. Nearly 20 years of experience has shown us that the current security situation only confirms that just one more year fighting Afghanistan is not a solution, but a recipe for being there indefinitely. It's up to the Afghans to make the decision about the future of their country. Others are more direct. Their argument is that we should stay with the Afghan and Afghanistan indefinitely. In doing so, they point to the fact that we have not taken losses in this last year. So they claim that the cost of just maintaining the status quo is minimal. But that ignores the reality and the facts that already presented on the ground in Afghanistan when I took office. The Taliban is at its strongest militarily since 2001. The number of U.S. forces in Afghanistan had been reduced to a bare minimum. And the United States and the last administration made an agreement with the Taliban to remove all our forces by May 1 of this year. That's what I inherited. That agreement was the reason the Taliban had ceased major attacks against U.S. forces. So let me ask those who want us to stay, how many thousands more Americans' daughters and sons are you willing to risk? How long would you have them stay? Already we have members of our military whose parents fought in Afghanistan 20 years ago. Would you send their children and their grandchildren as well? Would you send your own son or daughter? After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces. 2,448 Americans killed, 20,722 more wounded, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health. I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome.
President Biden also expressed more practical reasons for ending our military involvement in Afghanistan now.
If in April, I had instead announced that the United States was going back on that agreement made by the last administration, the United States and allied forces would remain in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future, the Taliban would have again begun to target our forces. The status quo was not an option. Staying would have meant U.S. troops taking casualties, American men and women back in the middle of a civil war. And we would run the risk of having to send more troops back into Afghanistan to defend our remaining troops. Once that agreement with the Taliban had been made, staying with a bare minimum force was no longer possible.
Which even General-turned-Lockheed Martin board member Joseph Dunford had to acknowledge as a reality while recommending a continuation of the war, which has been so profitable to the defense contractors like the one he now currently serves and profits from.
Do we need to increase forces if the Taliban don't accept an extension past the 1st of May, and if they then would reinitiate attacks against U.S. forces? And Chairman, we heard exactly what you heard. In the fall, what we were told by commanders on the ground in the Department of Defense was that 4,500 U.S. forces, in addition to the NATO forces that are there, was the minimum level to address both the mission as well as protection of our forces in the context of the conditions that existed in the fall. And as you've highlighted, those conditions have only gotten worse since the fall. So in our judgment, 2,500 would not be adequate should the Taliban reinitiate attacks against the United States.
Which, if we went back on our word, after fighting us for 20 years nonstop, the Taliban almost certainly would have attacked our troops again. You know, what good are American promises if they're easily broken by the next president? Trust is earned, and the whole world was watching. But where trust is concerned, this is the point where President Biden's thinking starts to look pretty sketchy in hindsight. This next clip is from July 8th, and just for context, the date we promised to be out of Afghanistan was August 31st, and the date that the Taliban took over was August 15th. So again, this is from July 8th.
Do I trust the Taliban? No. But I trust the capacity of the Afghan military, who is better trained, better equipped, and more competent in terms of conducting war.
After listening to the book version of the Afghanistan Papers, which were initially non-public, honest interviews with the most senior members of our government and military, and which were released to the public a year and a half ago, trust in the competence of the Afghanistan government seems absurd. Because year after year after year, even though they were telling the public about great progress being made with the Afghan military and police forces, well, behind the scenes, they all knew damn well that the Afghanistan military and police forces were a mess and not nearly as competent as the Taliban has proven itself to be. They were so frank about their assessments behind closed doors that it makes their lies in public so obvious and so egregious. They knew that the Afghan military was made up of a lot of people that were just there for the paycheck. They knew that a lot of the members of the military and police force were hooked on drugs. Drugs being heroin, sleepy drugs, not the kind that make you all amped up and motivated. They also knew from interviewing the members of the Afghanistan military and police forces that if the Americans left, they intended to stop fighting too. They knew that members of the Taliban itself were infiltrating the military and police forces. And they knew this stuff for years, and it never got better. And in the last few years, the Taliban has been getting stronger and stronger. And again, this information became public in 2019. And so President Biden certainly had it available to him. On top of that, more recently, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, the guy paid to tell us how things are going in Afghanistan, John Sopko, provided this testimony to Congress. This is from March 10th, more than a month before the withdrawal decision was announced.
But right now, that state is under threat. In the wake of the February 22, 2020 withdrawal agreement, all is not well. Compromise appears in short supply on either side. Taliban attacks have actually increased since the agreement was signed. Assassination of prominent officials, activists, journalists, aid workers, and others have also increased, including an unsuccessful attack on one of the female members of the peace negotiating team. And a Taliban offensive on Kandahar City last October, as peace negotiations were ongoing, may well have succeeded were it not for U.S. air support. Peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban have achieved little for Afghanistan so far, and only time will tell as to whether the new Biden administration initiative will bear fruit. And the Afghan people's fears for its own government's survival are exacerbated by the knowledge of how dependent their country is on foreign military and financial support.
And a few minutes later, in the same hearing in March, John Sopko explained exactly what he meant when he said that the Afghanistan government was dependent on foreign support for its survival. And just FYI, when he says SIGAR, that stands for Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, which is what he's in charge of.
Another equally serious threat to Afghanistan's stability has also largely been ignored as we focus on the boots on the ground in Afghanistan. And that is the provision of last year's U.S. Taliban agreement that stipulates that in addition to the departure of U.S. and coalition troops, all non-diplomatic civilian personnel, private security contractors, trainers, advisors, and supporting service personnel also must leave the country by May 1st. Should this come to pass, SIGAR and many others believe this may be more devastating to the effectiveness of the Afghan security forces than the withdrawal of our remaining troops. Why is that? Because the Afghan government relies heavily on these foreign contractors and trainers to function. In the first quarter of fiscal year 2021, there were over 18,000 Defense Department contractors in Afghanistan, including 6,000 Americans and 7,000 third country nationals, 40% of whom are responsible for logistics, maintenance, or training tasks. Now, it is well known that the Afghan security forces need these contractors to maintain their equipment, manage supply chains, and train their military and police to operate the advanced equipment that we have purchased for them. For example, as of December, the Afghan National Army was completing just under 20% of its own maintenance work orders, well below the goal of 80% that was set and the 51% that they did in 2018. So that's actually going down. The Afghan National Police were just as bad, if not worse, undertaking only 12% of their own maintenance work against a target of 35% and less than the 16% that we reported in our 2019 high-risk list. Additionally, and more troubling, the Department of Defense's Train, Advise, and Assist Command Air, or commonly called TAC Air, recently reported that since late 2019, they have reduced their personnel in Afghanistan by 94%, and that the military drawdown now requires near total use of contract support to maintain the Afghan air fleet. They assess that, quote, further drawdown in the associated closure of bases will effectively end all in-country aviation training contracts in Afghanistan. Again, why is this significant? Why do we view this as a high risk? Namely, because contractors currently provide 100% of the maintenance for the Afghan Air Force UH-60 helicopters and C-130 cargo aircraft, and a significant portion of Afghan's light combat support aircraft. TAC Air this January gave a bleak assessment, namely that no Afghan airframe can be sustained as combat effective for more than a few months in the absence of contractor support.
And so those of you who listen to the bonus thank you episodes might remember that not too long ago, within the last few thank you episodes, I told you that the Biden administration plan was to keep about 18,000 contractors in Afghanistan. And now we know why. Here's President Biden from July 8th.
We provided our Afghan partners with all the tools, let me emphasize, all the tools, training equipment of any modern military. We provided advanced weaponry, and we're going to continue to provide funding and equipment, and will ensure they have the capacity to maintain their Air Force.
Maintenance of an Air Force that is performed 100% by contractors. But contractors are private. That's the point of privatization. To have the private sector, the for-profit funnels money to shareholders sector, perform as many tax money funded tasks as possible. Privatization, let's just be clear, is a way to funnel public money into private pockets. And the Afghanistan war was privatized to the point that the contractors combined to be the largest force in Afghanistan. And a consequence of that, aside from the expense, is that these companies do not answer to the commander-in-chief. They do not take orders. They can do essentially what they want. And they wanted to leave Afghanistan. And so when shit got real, they did, regardless of what our government wanted them to do. And we know that it was not the original intention of the people in leadership positions in the military for the contractors to leave because of the contracts themselves. The Department of Defense issued $931 million in contracts to 18 companies related to work in Afghanistan that was set to continue past the May 1st withdrawal date negotiated by President Trump. Now, the vast majority of those, but not all of them, were signed under the Trump administration. But there were contractual signs that the Biden administration intended for contractors to stay too. So, for example, in April, the same month that President Biden announced our withdrawal, 70 American security and defense firms started advertising more than 100 new security and intelligence positions in Afghanistan, some with contracts that go beyond September 2021. Now, the plan, according to senior Afghan military officials, was to use the military base that we abandoned, Bagram, as a hub for all these contractors who would be working with the Afghan military, which can help explain why Raytheon, as recently as May, was posting for logistics and intelligence analyst positions at Bagram. And by the way, just a little side note, Raytheon has spent the most on lobbying Congress this year. They're up to $8.23 million and counting. But anyway, around the same time, CACI and BAE Systems, which is the company where Afghanistan Study Group co-chair Kelly Ayotte sits on the board of directors, well, those companies both posted jobs for signals intelligence specialists for an estimated term of 12 months in Afghanistan, also well past the anticipated withdrawal dates. Now, upon first glance, this might not make sense because the highest ranking officials in the military in the Biden administration said that they intended for contractors to leave the country when the military did. But the thing is that many contractors don't work for the military to begin with. A lot of them are technically hired and funded by the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. And so that's the wiggle room. That's how they were going to get around their promises to remove all of them. The Defense Department made those promises, not the State Department. And I told you about this weeks ago, that the plan was to continue to pay for the military and police in Afghanistan, but just funnel that money through the State Department to the Afghan government, and then the money would get to the military and police officers. They just added a few more middlemen to make it seem less like we were still funding all of that. And it appears, before the Afghanistan government ceased to be a thing anymore, that the plan was to use that same route to get the contractors paid as well. But the contractors don't have to be too upset about the end of the Afghanistan war, at least not as far as their current contracts are concerned, because our government is in the position of potentially now having to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements to these private companies for the profits that they were expecting to make on those contracts. We're going to owe the private sector money for tasks that were never even completed because we've hollowed out our own military, because there were so many tasks that are no longer done in-house anymore. In Afghanistan, we don't know the exact number and probably never will, since professional auditors have already declared that auditing the Department of Defense to be literally impossible. But in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, the U.S. has spent at least $89 billion in taxpayer dollars to fund the building and training of the Afghan National Army, with an estimated $2.26 trillion in total operating costs funded by U.S. taxpayers. And since the U.S. military actions in Afghanistan were authorized in September 2001, the stocks of the top 5 defense companies have risen in value by an average of nearly 900%. Because it turns out, this was news to me, but it turns out that more than half of our massive defense budget is now going to contractors. That's how extreme the privatization of our military has gotten. And that's not counting the contractor money that flows from the State Department and USAID. And when it comes to contractors doing the tasks that members of our military used to do in-house, there has been report after report after report telling us that we are being ripped off. $70 million was embezzled by a trucking company. $1.6 million was wasted on a water filtration system constructed so poorly that it failed after only 2 months. We're getting $600 bills to replace 20-cent bolts. If I listed all of the examples, this episode would be days long. And so we know who paid for the Afghanistan war. Monetarily, it was us taxpayers, and we got ripped off so many times to a stunning extent. And that sucks, and it's not okay. But when it comes to paying for the war, we also had 2,442 members of our military pay for it with their lives. But on top of that, we also have to acknowledge that individual contractors also paid with their lives. 3,936 U.S. contractors died in Afghanistan, which means that more contractors died in Afghanistan than members of our military, but their deaths are often ignored. But the higher death toll among contractors makes sense if you know that for much of this war, contractors outnumbered U.S. troops. This was true starting around the height of the Obama administration's surge, when there were 99,800 U.S. military members in Afghanistan compared to 117,227 contractors. And it remained true right up until the spring of this year. When President Biden announced the withdrawal in April, we had 2,500 troops in Afghanistan and 18,000 contractors. And so with more contractors in Afghanistan, a deadly place over the last 20 years, more contractors than U.S. troops ended up dead there. On top of that, 1,144 troops from our partner countries died, along with between 66 and 69,000 Afghan national military members and police. And then, of course, there are the civilians who never signed up to fight anyone, but who died in the crossfire or in the bombs. The official toll, according to military.com, is that 47,000 civilians died, along with 51,000 people who've been branded as opposition fighters. But notice that these numbers are rounded. We never did an exact count. Also, the Afghanistan papers make it crystal clear that our military never really knew which Afghan was a part of which group, if they were a part of any groups at all. I don't believe for one second that all of the people branded as enemy combatants actually were. The truth is that we don't know, and we will never know exactly how many civilians were killed in Afghanistan. It's at least tens of thousands, multiples of the number of Americans that were killed on 9/11. And I think it would be wise to remember that as the corporate media, funded with ads paid for by defense contractors, keeps parading out the same elite liars who chose to pursue this regime change, who never changed the strategy to a more Afghan-centered one, who often left government and went straight to profit on the boards of directors of defense contractors, and who have been trashing President Biden for ending that oh-so-profitable war all over the cable news stations. You know, you may remember, because I was pissed about it when I saw it, that around the same time that the Afghanistan papers were published in late 2019, Congress passed a defense authorization into law, which Donald Trump signed, which limited the amount of money that we are allowed to pay civilians who accidentally get killed by our military and our partners to $3 million per year total out of a war budget of well over $700 billion a year. And none of these military leaders or CIA spooks and defense contractor board members who wanted this war to continue, who have been invited all over the cable news shows, none of them said a goddamn word about that law limiting payments to those that we've killed to $3 million combined per year. They didn't give a shit. And so I don't believe for one second that they give a shit about Afghans now. I think that the Afghanistan war was very lucrative for the leaders of the war industry, and that's why they wanted it to continue, not to make the world a great place for Afghan girls, because they didn't seem to mind it when Afghan girls were getting blown to bits by bombs and bullets for the last 20 years. And when we did acknowledge their deaths, they were just fine with compensating those families with crumbs. The Afghans paid the heaviest price for the Afghanistan war and ended up back under Taliban rule anyway. That's the tragedy. What happened to them? But who benefited from the war? Well, the only clear winners of this war were the Taliban, although not really. They've had a lot of people die too. But the real winners were the defense contracting companies and the shareholders who profited from what those war profiteers did, which, yes, includes a lot of us peasants wealthy enough to have money in the stock market. But it was the richest among the shareholder class, the ones who benefited the most. And then that money, in turn, flowed right back to members of Congress, the people trusted to hand out our money and make decisions about matters of war. Over the course of the Afghan war, the defense industry spent over $2.3 billion with a B, lobbying for their interests in the halls of Congress. That money went often to former members of Congress and their staffers who were paid to go back to their friends and coworkers who were still in power to convince them to make laws to benefit the war profiteers. $2.3 billion made a lot of ex-lawmakers rich. And then there's the direct campaign contributions, aka legal bribes. Over the course of the Afghanistan war, people in the defense industry, the private contractors, gave at least $190 million directly to sitting members of Congress for their reelections. And right now, at least 47 members of Congress and their spouses currently hold between $2 million and $6.7 million worth of stock in large defense contractors. And hat tip to the amazing journalists at Sludge for finding that out. If you're a fan of this show, Sludge should be on your reading list. Because Sludge also told me that 5 Republican senators who are invested in defense contractors sit on the Appropriations Committee, which means that they are on the Senate committee that spends our tax money. We just learned that a quarter of our money that these committees spend every year is going to defense contractors. And therefore, we know that a piece of that is therefore also going right back into their pockets. The shamelessness of Republicans is stunning. But of course, while Republicans tend to be the worst offenders when it comes to glaring conflicts of interest, they seem to have no shame. Democrats have conflicts of interest too. And one of the names that I was deeply disappointed to find on this list of senators profiting from war contractors is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, Mr. Get Money Out of Politics himself. But he's not practicing what he preaches because he has $500,000 invested in defense contractors Honeywell, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon. No one knows how to disappoint you quite like a Democrat. Both of these parties are corrupted to their cores. And it's disgusting how many of them make money from war profiteers through campaign contributions and stock market bets. There are so many names on the list of Congress members who are making money off of war. And if you want to see them, they're in the show notes for you. Because yes, if this is your first time listening to my show, the show notes have all my sources for everything I'm telling you. I don't expect you to just trust me. You deserve to see this stuff for yourself. But basically, the Afghanistan war was a racket. Although, as Major General Smedley Butler warned us 90 years ago, all wars are rackets. But the Afghanistan war was in a league of its own. Because the Afghans' dependency on contractors was not a system specially designed for them. As David Sedney, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, explained to Foreign Policy magazine, quote, "We built the Afghan army in our image to be an army that operates with air support and intelligence whose backbone is contractors," unquote. The system in Afghanistan was designed based on what they did to our military. Throughout the war, and not just in the Afghanistan war, but the Iraq war too, so much wasted taxpayer money was built into the contracts that we signed to have for-profit companies perform the tasks that the military used to do themselves. For example, so many contracts included provisions that prevented the military from fixing their own equipment. These contracts required our military to return the parts or even the entire devices as large as vehicles and planes, to the company for maintenance. And of course, this arrangement increased the costs for the Department of Defense and therefore us taxpayers. There were very high shipping costs associated with sending stuff back and forth to Afghanistan. And this could be dangerous for our military members as they were without their equipment. They were without the stuff they needed as it was being schlepped back and forth across the world. Now, this arrangement in our military is new. From the 1940s until the 1970s, the Department of Defense invested a lot of money in research and development, and therefore, without question, the military had the right to repair their own equipment that they had paid to invent. But in my lifetime, during this era of the baffling belief that is far too prevalent that the private sector is always better, well, military research and development has been shifted to the private sector. Our government doesn't own the technology that we use in war anymore. On top of that, Congress in the 1990s, the same Congresses that did corporate favors like deregulate the banks and deregulate the media, well, those same Congresses exempted commercial items from many of our laws that were designed to make sure that us taxpayers wouldn't get ripped off. Now, the idea behind exempting commercial items from procurement laws is that they said that the commercial items, so items created in the private sector, they said those items had prices set by the market. And so there was no need for government-specific pricing and contract negotiations. Congress also, in law, which is still law, required federal agencies to purchase commercial items, quote, to the maximum extent practicable, unquote. But in the years that followed, the large defense contracting companies bought up all the little ones, which they could do because we've essentially stopped enforcing antitrust laws in this country. This meant that the civilian market and its pricing mechanisms were distorted because if there's nowhere else to buy a product, the company that makes it can charge whatever they want. This reality then led to an explosion in sole source contracts being signed by our government, which are used when the government is unable to find competition for an item or service. And so it's limited to negotiating with just a single company. By 2016, half of the Department of Defense's contracting dollars were awarded without competition to monopolist companies. And in those situations, when there's only one company that can give our government what we need, that company sets the terms. It's that company that has the real power. And in Afghanistan, the contractors had so much power that their choices had the power to destroy the Afghan government. You already heard the Inspector General for Afghanistan, John Sopko, testify that so much of our support for the Afghanistan military was actually services provided by contractors. In that same March hearing, he also said this.
Today, our report suggests the donor community should realize the Afghan government is focused on a single goal, its survival. Afghanistan is more dependent on international support than ever before. It may not be an overstatement that if foreign assistance is withdrawn and peace negotiations fail, Taliban forces could be at the gates of Kabul in short order.
When foreign assistance, the contractors, were withdrawn, in fact, it didn't even take that long. When they were in the process of being withdrawn, The contractor-dependent military folded and the Afghanistan government collapsed. It was dangerous for the Afghanistan government to be so reliant on private contractors. In fact, I can't help but think about this testimony to the Senate that took place almost 10 years ago exactly. This was from September 2011. From Charles Tiefer, he was the commissioner on the Commission on Wartime Contracting. This is what he told the Senate.
Our private security in Afghanistan appears to be a major source of payoffs to the Taliban. Our report has the first official statement that it's the second largest source of money for the Taliban.
After drugs.
After drugs, that's right.
These contractors make their own rules. And by making the Afghan government so reliant on contractors, even after knowing the problems, including the fact that they were known to be financing the Taliban's ability to defeat the military we created, it shouldn't have been so surprising. That was a military created in the image of our own contractor-dependent military, our own military that devotes half of its dollars to contractors. And so there's an important lesson that we need to learn here about the dangers of contractor dependency. It's not just about wasteful spending, although that's infuriating and important, but it's about safety. Our troops deserve to have the ability to fix their own equipment, to know that the tools they need will be there when needed. And they also need to know that the people that they are working side by side with are loyal to the United States. Self-sufficiency is important. Loyalty is important. They should at least be able to trust that they're fighting with people on the same side. And right now, our guys don't have it by design. But this is a design that we do have the ability to change. And experts have been warning our government for at least a decade now that we should change it. Here's Clark Kent Ervin, who, yes, love that name. But here's Clark Kent Ervin, the commissioner on the Commission on Wartime Contracting, testifying to the Senate in that same hearing from 10 years ago.
It's critical that the government have a choice, and that means that there needs to be at least a small organic and expandable organic capacity on the part of these three agencies to perform missions themselves. So the next time there's a contingency, the government has a choice between going with contractors and going in-house, and the determination can be made whether it's more effective to do it either way, whether it's cheaper to do it either way. As we said at the inception, right now the government doesn't have an option. Contractors are the default option because they're the only option.
Now, which government was he talking about? Was he talking about Afghanistan or was he talking about ours? Now, I watched that hearing 5 years ago, so I honestly don't remember. But the fact that the situation he described is applicable to both governments, one of which we just saw collapse, that's a lesson that we need to learn and act upon. We just need to elect people who will prioritize the self-sufficiency of our troops and our government as a whole, because the Defense Department is far from the only one that has had its tasks privatized and is subservient to the words in contracts with private companies. Because again, the wasted money, so many billions of wasted money, that's bad, obviously. But the reliance on contractors and letting them set the terms in the contract with our government is also straight up dangerous, because there is clear evidence now that contracting was a reason why the collapse of the Afghan government was such a surprise to our country's leaders and why that chaotic evacuation became necessary. Here's the President of the United States on July 8th, expressing trust in the ability of the Afghan government and the military, or at least some trust that they wouldn't collapse right away.
Mr. President, how serious was the corruption among the Afghanistan government to this mission failing there?
Well, first of all, the mission hasn't failed yet.
But he had this level of trust, at least in part, because these were the numbers he was using for his assessments.
Together with our NATO allies and partners, we have trained and equipped over nearly 300,000 current serving members of the military, the Afghan National Security Force, and many beyond that who are no longer serving. Add to that hundreds of thousands more Afghan National Defense and Security Forces trained over the last 2 decades.
300,000. 300,000 forces is what he thought the Afghan military had. He even repeated this during the question and answer portion of that day.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well equipped as any army in the world. and an Air Force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
But that 300,000 number was garbage. 5 days after Biden's speech, Michael Tracy, who is a great independent journalist publishing his work on Substack, well, he spoke to a U.S. veteran who worked for the Joint Command that oversaw training of Afghan forces. Part of this veteran's job was to track the number of Afghan policemen who had completed their training. But he told Michael Tracy that the training camps were not operated by the U.S. military. They were operated by contractors hired by the State Department. In those contracts, the companies inserted terms that made the training numbers, the data on how many people had been successfully trained, proprietary, meaning that the company owned that information. Not the military, not the State Department, the company. And a repercussion of that is that they were not legally required to provide our government with accurate numbers regarding how many Afghans they had trained. And I want to quote the rest of this directly from Tracy's interview. This is what the U.S. veteran, who I can't give you his name because Michael Tracy allowed him to stay anonymous so that he wouldn't be jeopardizing his benefits by talking to journalists. But here's what the veteran said, quote, "When they would give me these figures, I would total them up because I'm compiling reports that are presumably going back to be presented before Congress to justify expenditures. And I had a Marine Corps major that was part of the command section that would come in and he'd say, hey, we're supposed to cycle through 300 police recruits this month. This says only 150 got through. It's supposed to be 300. And I'm like, okay, well, it wasn't 300. It was 150. Well, can you massage this report so it says 300? Basically, he was saying, can you lie on this report so it says 300? So just the whole flow of information was not in any way remotely transparent. And it was set up so really the only people that knew anything for certain were the contractors. The command staff couldn't leverage from them accurate information, unquote. And so here we have the president of the United States making decisions based on numbers that he was given about the strength of the Afghan army. Numbers he was given telling him how many humans would be fighting against the Taliban. Now, 300,000 versus 75,000, it does look like good odds for the Afghan government if that 300,000 number were reliable. But it wasn't because contracts. This is dangerous. And it led to this kind of confidence in our president.
Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
Now, Joe Biden has always been an arrogant son of a bitch. And so I'm not excusing him from responsibility because there were many signs that the Afghan government was weaker than the Taliban. And you didn't need any additional paperwork from the spooks to see it. Although, that said, I should mention that on the same day that Michael Tracy published his article, July 13th, there was an internal classified State Department memo signed by 23 U.S. embassy staffers in Afghanistan that warned of the potential collapse of Kabul. And we know that this was received by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, but it never reached the White House or the National Security Council, which were the people who were coordinating our exit from Afghanistan. Now, that memo was received by the State Department a month before the government collapsed. And so that does represent a missed opportunity to start the evacuations earlier. But even without that lost report, there were cigar reports and testimony and media reports constantly warning about the Afghan government's problems going back 2 decades. But the fact is, for whatever reason, the Biden administration didn't see it coming. Here's General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, speaking to reporters on August 18th, 3 days after the Afghan government went bye-bye.
The time frame of a rapid collapse that was widely estimated and ranged from weeks to months and even years following our departure. There was nothing that I or anyone else saw that indicated a collapse of this army and this government in 11 days.
When I hear that and I think about, how is it possible that they can be so clueless? My brain keeps revisiting this testimony from January 2020, when the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, John Sopko, testified to Congress. Now, I played these clips originally in episode 210, my other Afghanistan episode that was released like 10 seconds before COVID, but I cannot get this testimony out of my head.
We've almost created a system that forces people in the government to give happy talk success stories because they're over there on very short rotations. They want to show success. The whole system is almost geared to give you, and it goes up the chain of command, all the way to the president sometimes. He gets bad information from people out in the field because somebody's on a 9-month rotation. He has to show success, and that goes up.
And this was his suggestion for how this problem can be fixed.
Maybe incentivize honesty. And one of the proposals I gave at that time, because I was asked by the staff to come up with proposals, is put the same requirement on the government that we impose on publicly traded corporations. Publicly traded corporations have to tell the truth. Otherwise, the SEC will indict the people involved. They have to report when there's a significant event. So put that onus, call it the Truth in Government Act if you want, that you in the administration are duty-bound by statute to alert Congress to significant events that could directly, negatively impact a program or process. So incentivize honesty.
And that makes a lot of sense to me. The Afghanistan papers show that there was a lot of happy talk going on for 20 years. We were told over and over again that the Afghan military was getting stronger and stronger, while behind closed doors, those same exact people were saying the opposite. And who knows what they were telling our presidents. And of course, we also need honesty from our contractors, which we are definitely not getting in regards to billing or in regards to results achieved in return for our money. Because honesty requirements are missing from the contracts that the companies themselves are writing. That power dynamic between the companies and the government is the opposite of what it should be. Honesty requirements. That's an actionable solution to some of the major problems exposed by the Afghanistan war. But once again, the question I have is whether or not our current members of Congress will start requiring honesty from members of our military leadership. Will they pass a law that has some ass in jail time if people in the military lie to make themselves look good? And will they pass a law requiring honesty in contracts? But then I look at this current Congress, the one elected in 2020. This Congress took almost $35 million, split damn near evenly between the two parties in direct campaign contributions from the defense industry, which, that's the industry that benefits from the happy talk and the contracts that allow corporate secrecy. We also know that so many of our lawmakers are betting on these companies in the stock market too. With that level of corruption in our own current Congress, I'm not holding my breath. Once again, the first step to any solution to our problems ends up being that we have to fire these people, especially the leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties. Just the fact that they have allowed these conflicts of interest to exist in our Congress is proof that they have to go. But back to Afghanistan. With the withdrawal date set at August 31st, on Wednesday, August 11th, President Biden was actually so confident that he was getting ready to go on vacation. But by the morning of Thursday, August 12th, the Secretary of Defense was recommending that President Biden send troops to evacuate our embassy in the Afghanistan capital and to protect the main international airport. 2 days later, we found out that the deputy speaker of the Afghan parliament had become the Taliban police chief in Kabul. And the day after that, on Sunday, August 15th, President Ashraf Ghani fled Afghanistan and the Taliban took over the presidential palace. And I read an important assessment of why the Afghan military collapsed, which was written by the commander of the Afghan Special Forces on August 25th and published in the New York Times. He said there were three main reasons why the Afghan military collapsed. He said the first factor was former President Trump's February 2020 peace deal with the Taliban, which he said, quote, doomed them, unquote, by putting an expiration date on our involvement in the country. He said, quote, the final days of fighting were surreal. We engaged in intense firefights on the ground against the Taliban as U.S. fighter jets circled overhead, effectively spectators. Our sense of abandonment and betrayal was equaled only by the frustration U.S. pilots felt and relayed to us, being forced to witness the ground war apparently unable to help us. Overwhelmed by Taliban fire, my soldiers would hear the planes and ask why they were not providing air support. Morale was devastated. Across Afghanistan, soldiers stopped fighting, unquote. Then the second factor that he blamed for the collapse of the Afghan military is one that I think we've already covered in depth, which is the loss of contractor logistics and maintenance support, which they literally couldn't function without. He said, quote, the Afghan forces were trained by the Americans using the U.S. military model based on highly technical special reconnaissance units, helicopters, and airstrikes. We lost our superiority to the Taliban when our air support dried up and our ammunition ran out. Contractors maintained our bombers and our attack and transport aircraft throughout the war. By July, most of the 17,000 support contractors had left. A technical issue now meant that aircraft, a Black Hawk helicopter, a C-130 transport, a surveillance drone, would be grounded. The contractors also took proprietary software and weapon systems with them. They physically removed our helicopter missile defense system. Access to the software that we relied on to track our vehicles, weapons, and personnel also disappeared. Real-time intelligence on targets went out the window too. And then third, he blamed the corruption within the Afghan government. He said, quote, "That really is our national tragedy. So many of our leaders, including in the military, were installed for their personal ties, not for their credentials," unquote. Is anyone else thinking of Jared and Ivanka in the White House? Our entire system of appointments to important positions. You know, people getting government positions based on personal ties is a problem that I think we can relate to here in the States as well. And so, should the Biden administration have seen the collapse coming? Probably. Should they have started the evacuation earlier? Probably. Although they didn't have all the information available, and some of the information they did have was straight up wrong, so I don't know. All I know is that on August 15th, the government we created in Afghanistan was gone, and the Taliban took control of the country. And when that happened, there were still thousands of U.S. citizens in the country working as contractors for the State Department and USAID, along with American citizens working at nonprofits who had to be evacuated from the country. There was one suicide bomb that killed 13 members of our military who were helping with that evacuation. They were the last to die in Afghanistan, along with hundreds of Afghans trying to flee the new Taliban government. It was so tragic. But as of this recording, most of the U.S. citizens have gotten out of Afghanistan unharmed, and planes are still leaving Afghanistan's airport with Americans on board as I speak. There's been a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking going on about the withdrawal and the evacuation, but I think there's a lot of truth to the idea that there's no good way to exit Afghanistan. Bagram Air Force Base, which we closed a few months ago, is an hour away from Kabul, and 2,500 troops wasn't enough to guard both locations, the Air Force Base and the airport, and the long road in between them. 2,500 troops wasn't enough to guard just the airport. And when it comes to the evacuation timing, over the summer, Afghanistan's president, Ashraf Ghani, he asked President Biden to hold off on evacuations, fearing that the evacuations would undermine confidence in his government, which it surely would have. Now, I personally don't think that confidence in that government was warranted to begin with, but President Biden did decide to hold off on evacuations, choosing instead to give the Afghan government a chance. But our military did have an evacuation plan in case the government fell to the Taliban before our withdrawal. Here's General Mark Milley on August 18th.
Central Command submitted a variety of plans that were briefed and approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the President. These plans were coordinated, synchronized, and rehearsed to deal with these various scenarios. One of those contingencies is what we are executing right now. As I said before, there's plenty of time to do AARs and key lessons learned and to delve into these questions with great detail. But right now is not that time. Right now, we have to focus on this mission because we have soldiers at risk. And we also have American citizens and Afghans who supported us for 20 years also at risk. This is personal, and we're going to get them out.
The U.S. citizens are going to get out. Most of them already have. But the Afghans who supported us for 20 years, how about them? Are they going to get out? Well, there is a process already in place since 2009 to allow Afghans who partnered with our government to come and live here in the United States. It's called the Special Immigrant Visa Program. And here was President Biden's plan as he explained it on July 8th before the government collapsed.
We're also going to continue to make sure that we take on the Afghan nationals who work side by side with U.S. forces, including interpreters and translators, since we're no longer going to have military there after this. We're not going to need them, and they have no jobs. We're also going to be vital to our efforts, and they've been very vital, and so their families are not exposed to danger as well. We've already dramatically accelerated the procedure time for special immigrant visas to bring them to the United States. Since I was inaugurated on January 20th, we've already approved 2,500 special immigrant visas to come to the United States. Up to now, fewer than half have exercised their right to do that. Half have gotten on aircraft and commercial flights and come. Another half believe they want to stay, at least thus far. We're working closely with Congress to change the authorization legislation so that we can streamline the process of approving those visas. And those who have stood up for the operation to physically relocate thousands of Afghans and their families before the U.S. military mission concludes, so that if they choose, they can wait safely outside of Afghanistan while their U.S. visas are being processed.
So his plan for evacuating our Afghan partners went through this special immigrant visa program. And Congress did change the authorization language. Now, I don't know if the changes reflect exactly what the Biden administration was asking for, but attached to the law I talked about in the last main episode, the emergency funding for Capitol security after January 6th law, well, there was a dingleberry attached that made some changes to the special immigrant visa program for our Afghan partners. Or some of them, I should say. Because in the Capitol security law, Congress expanded eligibility to include Afghans who worked not only for the U.S. government for more than a year, but also to Afghans who worked for our allies as an off-base interpreter, or if they performed, quote, activities for United States military stationed at International Security Assistance Force or any successor name for such force, unquote. We are also now allowing the surviving spouse or child of an employee of the United States government abroad in Afghanistan to be eligible for immigration into the United States if that employee worked for our government for at least 15 years or was killed in the line of duty. In reality, what this means is that translators who worked for the U.S. in Afghanistan are eligible to apply for special immigrant visas, but current Afghan military members and police officers are not. And for Afghans who worked for us in some capacity other than translators for less than 15 years and survived, their families are not eligible. That means that someone could have been working with us for over a decade and would be left with the choice of remaining with their families in a country controlled by the Taliban or to come to the United States alone. And that's a terrible choice to force them to make. And let's also take a look at the number of visas allowed by Congress. In that new law signed on July 30th, just 2.5 weeks before the Afghan government collapsed, Congress expanded the number of special immigrant visas available for Afghans by 8,000, for a total of 34,500 to be allocated since December 19th, 2014. 34,500 total. But we know that including the eligible spouses and children of our Afghan partners, there are at least 53,000 Afghans who are eligible for the special immigrant visas. 53,000 people eligible for 34,500 visas. There's not enough. Congress didn't create enough. Regardless of the timing of the evacuation, Congress, both parties, decided that we were going to abandon thousands of Afghans who trusted our word. And I have a lot of details in here in my notes about the evacuations and what a cluster they were. Like how when the U.S. Embassy in Kabul decided to evacuate on Friday, August 13th, they destroyed all of their sensitive documents, including copies of the passports of Afghans who had already applied for the special immigrant visas, making it impossible to identify them as they lined up at the airport and tried to leave. And like how all the requests for processing Afghans were directed to a single email address at the State Department, an email address which was full and couldn't accept any messages. But really, when it comes to the details, what else do we need to know other than Congress created fewer visas than Afghan partners who are eligible for them? Now, there are other avenues for gaining entry into the United States, of course, mainly our overburdened refugee system, which is already swamped with applicants arriving at our southern border. But the shameful fact, one that makes this American taxpayer sick to my stomach, is that the lawmakers who represent us in this world never intended to get all our partners out. The numbers don't lie. And so what happens now? Well, for our Afghan partners stuck in Afghanistan, I don't know. I'm afraid for them, and I feel so much guilt about the way they've been treated by my country. And I think it's impossible that there won't be blowback. 9/11 was blowback. 9/11 was a crime committed by Saudis who were angry that our military was in their country. And so how will the children of the Afghans who trusted us and who are retaliated against, who were killed by the Taliban, going to feel about the United States and us citizens who supposedly control this government and certainly fund it? How could there not be blowback? And I can't help but feel like it's going to be deserved. We let the Afghanistan war go on for 20 years. And at the end of it, our representatives didn't create enough visas for those that trusted us. the Afghans will blame us. And why shouldn't they? Because this is a democracy, right? The American people tell the whole world that we have the best government because we get to choose our own leaders. Now, let's set aside the reality that marketing of our government is becoming less and less true, but that is the image we portray of ourselves and our government around the world. We pick our leaders. And with the power to choose our own leaders comes responsibility. And yet, look what we've done. And even though our military is no longer stationed inside Afghanistan, we're still in the neighborhood. And we're not done with them yet.
But make no mistake, our military and intelligence leaders are confident they have the capabilities to protect the homeland and our interests from any resurgent terrorist challenge emerging or emanating from Afghanistan. We are developing a counterterrorism over-the-horizon capability that will allow us to keep our eyes firmly fixed on any direct threats to the United States and the region and act quickly and decisively if needed.
You know what over-the-horizon capability is political speak for? Drones. We have flying robots of death that we can operate from over the horizon that can drop bombs on Afghanistan quickly and decisively if needed. And it's not just Afghanistan.
Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized beyond Afghanistan. So, we are repositioning our resources and adapting our counterterrorism posture to meet the threats where they are now, significantly higher in South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa.
The Afghanistan war may be over. We've finally given up on that regime change after 20 years. But the war on terror still continues. We have a lot more war ending to do, and President Joe Biden doesn't intend to do it. You know, I'm recording this episode the day before the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. And as terrible as that day was, I'm finding myself mourning the following 20 years more. 9/11 was used to fundamentally shift our government into something that I'm not proud of. You know, we're the wagers of the war on terror, which in reality is terrorizing people all around the world who have done nothing to hurt any of us. Can you imagine going to sleep, hearing the buzz of armed drones above your house, knowing that a lawless superpower that has launched 2 official wars and so many more unofficial ones has been dropping bombs on countries around the world and getting away with it for decades, with no accountability from the world or its own citizens at home? That's terrifying. That's terror. On 9/11, so many people in this world rallied behind us, and we used that support to become, I don't know how else to say it, bad guys. And maybe we always were, I don't know. But after 9/11, I'm just so ashamed of our behavior. We've been reckless with so many lives, launching wars of arrogance to switch governments in countries that we never bothered to understand, just to, in the end, leave on purpose, knowing that thousands of people who trusted us will probably die. And I just wonder, as American citizens, as taxpayers, are we ever going to take responsibility for the people in our country that we are allowing to represent us and spend our money? Because on 9/11, Mitch McConnell was a top Republican in Congress. Nancy Pelosi was a top Democrat. Joe Biden himself was in the Senate. 20 years later, the same people who have been making bad decisions for 20 years in our names are still the ones in power. We haven't fired them. You know, when do we accept responsibility for that? When do we right our wrongs and use the power we collectively have to replace them? Are we ever going to do that? Because keeping these people in power is dangerous. And it's not just these people, it's the parties they belong to. Keeping the Republican and Democratic parties in power, it's dangerous. The similarities between our government and Afghanistan's were by design. That government was modeled by Republican and Democrat commanders-in-chief in our image, or at least the image of us that they think we should have. And look how that just turned out for Afghanistan. 3 things took the Afghan government down. 1, being abandoned by partners. Now, this hasn't happened to us yet, but after we reneged on our word with the Iran nuclear deal, and now as we are abandoning our Afghan partners, we're proving ourselves to be untrustworthy on the world stage. We keep this up and it's only a matter of time. Then 2, the Afghan government had an over-reliance on the private sector, on contractors, leading to a dangerous lack of self-sufficiency for the government. We know we have this problem put in place on purpose by the Republicans and Democrats and their weird faith in the infallibility of the private sector. And 3, there was corruption. And our entire campaign finance system is legalized corruption, and we all know it. The 2 political parties, both controlled by corporate interests, draw the boundaries of their own districts and collect millions of dollars every year from individuals and companies and make money in the stock market, betting on the industries that they are writing the laws to govern. We are inflicted with the same diseases that took Afghanistan's government down. And if we're aware of it, I don't see us doing much about it. You know, I want to feel hopeful. I want to give you something to take from this episode to make you feel better. I don't want to constantly produce a downer podcast, but we have a downer government. And as I reflect on the 20 years since 9/11, our government has gotten worse and worse. And we know who's doing it. What I don't know is how to mobilize the country to remove these 2 rotten parties from power. And so I don't really know how to end this episode. I have no solutions for you other than we have to fire these fuckers. It's the same song I've been singing for 9 years. And so instead of, continuing with this rant again, I'm going to end this episode with this. Here's President Biden on April 14th, the day he announced our withdrawal from Afghanistan.
You all know that less than 1% of Americans serve in armed forces. The remaining 99% of them, we owe them. We owe them. They've never backed down from a single mission that we've asked of them. I've witnessed their bravery firsthand during my visits to Afghanistan. They've never wavered in their resolve. They've paid a tremendous price on our behalf. And they have the thanks of a grateful nation.
And on that much, at least, I think we can all agree. Before I completely release you from this episode, I would like to thank all of our producers. This is a listener-supported podcast that I've been doing for 9 years and could not still be doing it without producers who have paid voluntarily for it. There's a reason that you haven't heard any ads during this episode or any other episode of Congressional Dish, because this podcast is operating on the value for value model, which means that I create episodes that have intrinsic value and you pay for them in whatever amount you consider fair. The only number that doesn't feel fair to me is 0. And I know a lot of people are hitting you up for money, but this podcast has become my full-time job and I've recently been able to hire more people. And it's just, I feel very, very lucky to have this community. So thank you to all our producers. And I want to take a minute to thank 3. For the first time, I am announcing 3 executive producers. And executive producers are people that have cumulatively contributed $535 to Congressional Dish. And every single time you do that, you're eligible for a producer credit, for an executive producer credit on the episode of your choice, an episode that you feel especially proud to produce. And so we have 3 executive producers who have finally hit their 535 threshold, although one of them has hit it multiple times. But I would like to thank Rachel Passer, and she is now going to be our executive producer on this episode. And she sent in an email, and we actually got this a while ago, but Rachel said, I've been a producer of Congressional Dish for several years and was wondering if my contributions have reached executive producer status yet. And yes, they have. And if any other producers are curious, we do keep track, or at least we have since my sister became my accountant in 2017. Just go ahead and check with us and we'll let you know where you're at. But yes, Rachel, you hit it. Back to her note, she said, I've made some one-time bonus contributions here and there as well. Anyway, if yes, I would like to be an executive producer for episode 238 if possible. It's just always been my favorite number. Thanks, Lauren and Jen, for all your hard work. Sincerely, Rachel. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for your contributions that have helped us keep it going. I would also like to thank Christopher Grizzle, who is now going to be the executive producer on Congressional Dish 237, Hunting Domestic Terrorists. And he sent in an email that said, Dearest Jennifer, for a while now, I figured I'd contributed enough to grant me executive producer status. I suck at math, so you might have to double check those numbers. If I do, it would be an honor to be an executive producer for Congressional Dish 237. That episode was super informative and got me a little hot, especially hearing about the great bills that are just sitting there, not moving. I fucking love you, Grizz. Thanks. He also said, P.S. I finally found your theme song on YouTube. Did you know there were 2 more verses to that song? I didn't know. And I had to explain to my 6-year-old granddaughter why the man told the son if he kept that up, he'd go blind. I haven't listened to the full version of Tired of Being Lied To probably since I started this podcast many years ago. Actually, when I started this podcast, I was using some crappy song that was just on GarageBand. So if you go back to the beginning of the catalog, you'll just hear a little ditty. It was like, doo 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 doo. It was awful. And then I found Tired of Being Lied To. And once I put it at the beginning and end of the show, I never listened to the full thing again. So no, I didn't know that there were 2 more verses, or at least I've long forgotten. I'm going to have to check it out again. So yeah, thanks for the heads up. And then he also sent in a PSS, which said, hit me up for bail money if when the government ever really does come after you. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, if that happens, you guys are funding my career. And so who else would I go to? Yeah, the Jennifer Briney Legal Defense Fund, or at least the Go Hunt Jennifer Briney Down Out of Guantanamo Fund. But let's just hope we don't actually get there. But it's been an interesting journey for me these past few weeks, focusing on the domestic terrorism legislation and Biden administration plans, and then going into this episode about Afghanistan. And I've had the terror laws and the post 9/11 world on my mind a lot lately. I just don't like the direction that we're going, and I'm super concerned about it. So as much as I joke about, the censors, they're going to come after me, and if there's a crackdown, I'm on the list. I joke about that stuff, but those are real nightmares that I have. So yeah, thanks for supporting me while I'm still here. And I'm very happy to have you on the executive producer list, Chris. And then finally, we have an anonymous executive producer. This person has actually been an executive producer and is very much appreciated on quite a few episodes, but he is going to be an executive producer on Congressional Dish 238. And by the way, I don't mind the anonymous executive producer credits. If you don't want to have your name on it, that's fine. But having the executive producer credit on an episode, it gives the episode itself credibility. It says that someone in this audience is especially proud of this episode. So I really love that this episode in particular is going to have 2 executive producers on it right off the bat, because I think this episode is so important, and the lessons that we should be learning from the Afghanistan war, I think those are so important. So thank you to both our anonymous executive producer and Chris for financing this episode. And our anonymous executive producer sent in an email. So he said, "Hi, Jen. Thank you in advance for taking on the important topic of the war in Afghanistan. Again, in your last thank you episode, you shared your continued frustration with our inability to change Congress substantially. And as you alluded to, with mainstream media framing every conversation and or directing attention elsewhere, most Americans who are struggling to keep their heads above water don't have the energy to look behind the curtain. I feel the debacle of the past 20 years in Afghanistan gives us the best shot at taking down members of Congress. The public is engaged and enraged right now. Granted, due to media framing, the outrage is being directed at critiquing the withdrawal. But if we can shift the focus to the trillions of dollars, much of which went out the door in cash with no accountability or was paid to U.S. contractors, and to the number of dead and wounded Americans and Afghans, perhaps we may weaken members of Congress, making them susceptible to a primary challenge next year. A prime example is Representative Adam Smith from Washington's 9th District. Smith has been on the House Armed Services Committee since 1997 and has been a ranking member of chairman for the past 10 years. If anyone in Congress was in a position to know what was and was not going on in Afghanistan, it would be Adam Smith. In fact, Matthew Ho, a veteran and author who resigned his commission over the massive fraud related to money laundering in Afghanistan, stated in an interview that in 2011, he spoke with Adam Smith, who told him that they knew the generals were lying to Congress about what was going on in Afghanistan, but there was nothing he could do about it. 4 of the top 5 contributors to Adam Smith's campaign since 1995 are Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman. He has received over $1.6 million from defense industries, and 90% of that was from political action committees. There needs to be accountability for the insane waste, both financially and physically. It is becoming clear to more and more Americans. The time is now to act on hanging the stone around the neck of as many corporate corrupt members of Congress as possible. Let's start with the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. I hope your listeners will look up their own members of Congress who serve on those committees and identify a progressive challenger to support in the coming election. Help that candidate tie the incumbent to Afghanistan and to war campaign bribes. And if they want to help primary Adam Smith, here is his replacement, Stephanie Gallardo. And then I will put this campaign website in the show notes. And then he goes on to say, And here's the episode of Crystal, Kyle, and Friends where Matthew Ho said Adam Smith told him there was nothing he could do about the lies the generals were telling them. He says that the clip-in point is about a minute in, so I will also put that episode in the show notes for you guys as well. But obviously, me and this executive producer are on the same page on everything when it comes to Afghanistan. Thank you so much for looking up that information about Adam Smith. And I think aiming for the people on those committees is a really, really good start. Because like I said, I think if we can't fire everyone in Congress, and there are some good eggs in Congress, I don't think there's enough to really worry about keeping them. The leadership, they need to go for sure. And a guy who's been the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee for like 10 years, he's a leader and he's got to go. So thank you so much for sharing that information and those links. And thank you, as always, for helping produce the show. All other producers, I will have a thank you episode for you next week with your thoughts on all of this. Until then, stay safe and I love you all. So yeah, talk to you later. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.